class. There's like two old ladies in the audience, and he's on a massive mic system with huge speakers. And it's like distorted. It's so loud. So below a certain quantity of people in the class, I just can't do the mic. It feels like it's too much. Because I always remember, so you're walking around some village, you see some Saudis screaming bloody murder with a massive microphone system, and there's one person in attendance. I was just at I guess it's like our version of a wake. Usually when you think of a wake, you think of Irish, and it's gregarious. And there's a lot of alcohol involved. It's a party. It seems a bit specific to Irish American culture. It doesn't seem like most groups of people celebrate a death. But I think to an outsider, we look like a wake. If you think about it, we have a big feast, and then we do kirtan, and it seems like an excited, happy situation. See, one of our devotees passed away. Her name was Lilavati Mataji. She was older, but I think she was in her 60s, so it wasn't like she was, that old. Of course, you guys it's really relative. You guys might be thinking, wow, 60s, that's a full life, but I'm 51, so I'm thinking 60s isn't that far away anymore. Her husband died in a car crash. His name was Dwarkadish Prabhu. And then she just declined rapidly over a few years and joined him. It was a very auspicious departure. She chanted japa and was reciting verses, and someone was reading the Bhagavatam to her, and she had tulsi leaves in her mouth and a garland on, and she left on Vamana Dvadasi, which is a pastime where Vishnu steps out of the material world into the spiritual world. The whole thing. It was the anniversary of her husband's passing away. The whole thing seemed very otherworldly, very auspicious from the external indicators. She also was a great devotee in her own right. She did her service. Even when she could hardly walk, she would come to the temple and do her service, doing arti. And done service for many, many years, as her husband had as well. So it was an auspicious passing. But I've known him since I was a kid, maybe 17. I can't remember when I met them. Maybe 89, 90, something like that. I've known them since I was a kid, since they were in their 30s, since their kids were just Nayika's age. So it's far out because they were, probably Shree's age or something like that when I met them. Like mid-30s. Not that Shree's the only person in their mid-30s in the group. Narayan and Dam and Leela, but it's far out because I met him 33 years ago or something like that. It was a long time. Maybe more, maybe 34 years ago. It was a long time ago. And it's sobering because we're all going to die. Get old and die, if we're lucky. Otherwise, we might just die. That can happen too. And so when somebody passes away from this world, inevitably it reminds you of your own mortality. Freud, he said that in many ways, people's lives are an attempt to not think about the reality of death. The reality that everything you're doing will more or less come to naught, and that everything is going to die and wither and grow old. It's interesting, but if you look at physics, you have the second law of thermodynamics, which is entropy, which is what creates time. And but if you have quantum physics, entropy isn't involved in quantum calculations. And so it ends up being that time, although existing, is plotted on a graph the same way length and width and depth, the first three dimensions, are plotted on a graph. So you end up creating these space-time worms where your life is plotted on a graph, and entropy isn't really a factor, and it's just your existence is you exist through all phases of time. And it's just how quantum mechanics works, because time starts to warp as you near the speed of light. And so it can also be, just as the general theory of relativity means that Einstein had two things, the general theory of relativity and the special theory of relativity. Anyway, general theory of relativity is that time and space warp as you approach near the speed of light. And gravity is affected also. And so there's just some very serious ramifications of that, but one of them is that time becomes an illusion. And that the same way we exist in space, we also exist within time, and you can plot time on a graph, and you can plot your movement through time on a graph, and you have to put arrows to know which way you're going, because otherwise entropy becomes just, as opposed to a real feature of reality is moving everything forward, which is what we experience, it becomes just another factor in the equation, which doesn't have to necessarily go in this direction or that direction. Do you guys follow that? Yeah, I mean, Einstein, when he was writing to a grieving widow of one of his friends, wrote that time is one of the strangest illusions, strangest persisting illusions. He was trying to comfort her, but he was too much of an egghead to comfort her properly, so he ended up getting all philosophical on her. Physics gets very philosophical past a certain point. In fact, in many ways, modern physicists are the philosophers. Because what's philosophy really doing? It's trying to make sense out of the world. It's trying to figure out what's going on. And so one way to figure out what's going on is to ask big questions. Who am I? Why am I here? What's the purpose of life? What's the meaning of time? What's a concept of self? Who am I? Fundamentally. Another way of answering that question is to assume physicalism, and then by assuming physicalism, that matter is all that exists, then what you are is a wholly material being, and therefore if I can plot the way matter moves, I've now understood you on your most fundamental level. So philosophy is about getting past all the superficial, apparent stuff and getting into what's fundamentally going on. If you assume materialism, that all you are is matter, not materialism, making money and having a nice house, not that materialism. Materialism is a philosophical school that matter is all that exists. That's why you call it physicalism. And so if you assume that matter is all that exists, then by figuring out what matter is doing, you've now understood the world and the person on the deepest level possible. And we find that big objects move in a deterministic way through time. And that gets into Newton's 3 laws and Kepler's laws, and it gets into Pythagoras and Euclid, and it gets into all the traditional, what would be considered classical physics, geometry, so on. But then when physicists were looking at light, and they were trying to figure out what was going on with light, light didn't quite fit Newton's models. Light was a little weird. They did this thing called the double slit experiment in 1801, a guy named Young. And so if you take a board, you cut 2 slits in it, and you shine a light through it. If you shine a light through one side, so you cover this side, so the light's just shining through one thing, the light just diffuses out. And then if you open both slits up, the light no longer diffuses out. It forms little like light, dark, light, dark, light, dark on the screen behind it. So now I've got a screen here and a backboard. You guys all familiar with the double slit experiment? You got a screen here and a backboard behind it, a board behind it. You cut 2 holes. You shine light through these 2 holes. If you cover one hole, the light goes through like a flashlight, just diffuses out. But if it goes through both holes, it then becomes light, dark, light, dark, light, dark on the backboard. But it should just be 2 flashlight things going through the lights, going through, and then maybe crisscrossing at a certain point. But it doesn't do that. Anyway, Newton thought that light was comprised of particles. And that's what creates shadows. You block those particles, you create a shadow, and that's what makes it reflect off of surfaces the same way that if you fire particles at the surface, they bounce back off the surface. So the light's also like that as well. But this double slit experiment flipped the whole thing on its head, because it indicated that that light followed the pattern of a wave as opposed to a particle. And that jammed up Newton's theories as a complete explanation of the world. Anyway, then they had this black box radiation, which is another set of experiments, and you have electromagnetism, which is another set of experiments. All these took place in the 1800s. But what they meant was that the rules of classical physics didn't really work for light. Light had some features that classical physics couldn't account for. And then they began having to expand. And then with the advent of the microscope and being able to figure out that there was a nucleus and atomic particles and how they moved, we realized that our physics of the world didn't actually explain the world. and that gave rise to quantum physics. Quantum physics is probabilistic. It's based on Schrödinger's equation. It's non-deterministic, so you can't tell exactly how things are going to happen. Classical physics is continuous, it's deterministic. Quantum physics is sporadic and non-deterministic. Classical physics deals with large objects, ping pong balls. Quantum physics deals with small objects, subatomic particles, atoms, how they move. They follow a whole different set of rules. They leap from one position to another. They exist in two spaces simultaneously. They seem to go against time. You know, in classical physics, you can't be in two places at once. In quantum physics, you can be in two places at once. It's called superpositioning, if I'm not mistaken. You can be in two places at once. But if you really think about it, what's actually happening is you're trying to explain the fundamental nature of reality. You're just assuming all there is. Oh, and quantum physics teaches that things exist both as a wave as well as a particle. You can see both. And so they teach this wave-particle duality. And time starts to disappear because things can exist in two places at once in a quantum world. And actually only by observing them do they commit to one place. As long as they're unobserved, then they exist in two potential places. And then when you observe them, they pick one place. There's all sorts of just really weird stuff. Einstein called the rules of quantum physics spooky. This spooky behavior. Because it's bizarre. It basically goes against everything you see with your eyes in the world. But when you start to look at the world through a microscope and through mathematical calculations, the world is very, very different, and those calculations hold. Anyway, the essence of what I'm saying is that everybody's trying to make sense out of what the world consists of. And even if you take math as something you can count on as your starting place, which is why Pythagoras and Euclid were philosophers and mathematicians. But if you want to build a good philosophy, you got to start with something undoubtable. And then you work from that undoubtable thing to other things. You follow? And so you're working from what's not doubtable to what is speculative. And you gradually figure out, what's this leads to this, leads to this, leads to this, and you try to move slowly and methodically. Good philosophers will do this. They'll state all their premises and they'll state all the major objections to their premises, the ones that would be difficult to overcome, the ones they feel confident to overcome, and they'll actually write out what they believe is a formula. So it's like a mathematical proof, but with ideas. And there's formal logical language, analytic logic, modal logic, which is very, very much like quantum physics. It talks about probability, the possibility of something, the probability of something. And so when you get into analytic philosophy and logic, they write mathematical equations with Greek letters and all sorts of stuff, and it looks like just really complicated physics. Because they're taking ideas and putting them together into formulas. And so there's this incredible crossover between math and logic and philosophy, where they're all really trying to do the same thing. And no one's been able to reconcile classical physics, the world we see around us, with quantum physics, the way the world exists on a small level. which is kind of a big deal. Because if I look at small objects, they behave in one way. If I look at big objects, they behave in another way. But there's no set of calculations which shows how both those things can be true at the same time. They appear to cancel each other out. They, in many ways, appear to be diametrically opposed. This one's non-deterministic. This one's deterministic. This one's continuous. This one's sporadic. This one's true for big objects. This one's true for small objects. This one's spooky. This one's not spooky. This one has time. This one has really a neutered version of time. You following this? This one's particles or waves. This one's wave-particle duality. These two worlds appear to be irreconcilable, mutually exclusive. Weirdly, quantum mechanics is all the rage. And so all the philosophers are doing quantum mechanics because classical mechanics has already been figured out. We've got that wired. Quantum mechanics is where you can do all the speculation. But the only serious speculation is a grand universal theory which reconciles the two, because otherwise you're ignoring large objects and half the world, or the majority of the world. You can explain how the atoms that make up something work, but you can't explain how these things in themselves work. You've got a problem. If you were able to reconcile these two, you would win the Scientist of the Millennium Award. Perhaps the Scientist of All Time Award. To say you're the greatest scientist in 1,000 years would be an understatement. You'd really have to say they were the greatest scientist since the dawn of science. They would be the greatest philosopher, scientist to ever exist. Because they'd have a coherent vision of the world where everything fit into its place. You guys following this? René Descartes was also, he was 17th century?
Yes. Yeah. 1600s.
Yeah, 17th century. He was kind of at the beginning of the Age of Enlightenment, or in the Renaissance period. Maybe not in the beginning, but in the Renaissance period, the Age of Enlightenment, just at the dawn of, even just before the Industrial Revolution. And he was vexed by a similar problem, that the mind and mental phenomena which existed, which were real, didn't seem to fit with physical phenomena, which also seemed real. And so he just divided them into, the mind-body problem. And that wasn't just it wasn't just like, oh, he did this. He did that so that people could pursue physical phenomena without having to do a grand universal theory all the time to try to reconcile the mind with the body, because it was just too big of a problem to solve. So don't break it down into smaller chunks, solve the physical world, and then we'll deal with the mental world separately. And that breaking things down into bite-sized chunks enabled the Industrial Revolution and the rise of quantum mechanics and Newton's laws came about in the same time period. There's great value in that because it's too big of a topic to deal with. And so you deal with just, what's right in front of you. And so what's right in front of us, the physical world, and we'll deal with the mental world later. That's a separate pursuit. This was a problem because for 350 years or some crazy amount of time, scientists basically didn't touch the mind. Up until practically the 80s. Up until the 1970s, 80s, philosophers, practically speaking, ignored the mind. Scientists / philosophers ignored the mind and just focused on physical theories of matter. And then they had to go back in, and now they're trying to cram the mind in. But there's a problem. The prevailing theory of mind is that, we're nothing more than electrochemical charges going off in the brain. And that consciousness, unified consciousness, which we all experience, is an emergent phenomena. The problem with that explanation is that emergence is when you can take precursor causes, and those precursor causes necessarily lead to certain results. And you can chart out how, assuming all these preconditions, then this emergent phenomenon that appears very, very strange, swarms of bees or traffic jams, how they behave, you can ultimately calculate the exact physics of how that occurred. Therefore, it appears to be spooky, but actually all the math perfectly explains it. You follow? Einstein talked about how, during an eclipse in the early 1900s, one of his colleagues went out to watch the eclipse to prove the theory, and Einstein said he just didn't trust the math. I went to sleep and slept like a baby. I knew what I plotted was going to be true. And so with emergence, if you are able to know the preconditions, then you can show automatically what the result is going to be, even if it seems unusual. The math works out. The thing is, how do chemicals become conscious? There's no math you can use from chemistry. Chemistry is based on physics. And then if you take the view that biology is based on chemistry, there is no version of chemistry which must or should or even conceivably would ever give rise to consciousness, unified conscious experience, like we experience as human beings. You guys didn't follow that. It's okay. Maybe I'm introducing some new terms, or maybe you're tired, you're jet lagged or something. I'm going to say it again. Listen now, because this was an important point in the class. If you're saying that this is emergent, that would mean, to say that and have it be reasonable, you would have to then show, here are the preconditions, and given all these preconditions, even though this looks really weird, I can explain exactly how that had to happen. How it happened. The thing is, you could never predict consciousness from chemical states. From what we know about the world of chemicals, from what we know about the world of physics, going back before chemicals. There's nothing that would explain consciousness. Therefore, the claim of emergence is preposterous. It's unscientific. It's ridiculous. There's no evidence to support it. It just becomes a fake explanation. Because emergence requires you to be able to predict it, and we couldn't predict it. Emergent means these things will result in this, at least probabilistically. There's nothing to show even the possibility of consciousness. What to speak of the probability of it, what to speak of the certainty of it. So you've got this quantum world, and these quantum physicists, they are the philosophers of the modern age. But they ignore the fact that consciousness is as much a problem for them as it was for René Descartes 3.5 centuries ago. And that there's no reasonable theory of mind, and that there is still a hard problem, an insuperable problem, that consciousness exists and it does not fit within current physicalist theories, including quantum theories. And so in the same way, a classical physics wasn't enough because there was weird stuff that was going on with light that couldn't be explained. But that doesn't mean that this stuff isn't real. Now we have this other world, this quantum world, that has to be reconciled with the larger world, the classical world, the world of large objects, planets and ping pong balls. Us. So just because this wasn't sufficient and you went over here, doesn't mean you've reconciled these two, and you're still a half a philosopher if you haven't reconciled these two, and no one has. But then even if you were to reconcile those two and you're going to become the scientist of all time, there's this other thing going on, which is consciousness, that neither one of these predicts. And now your physics would have to also include consciousness. You follow this? Did you guys follow that or not? Brilliant guys like Euclid and Pythagoras and Isaac Newton and Kepler. Brilliant guys. They figured out the way the world works. But then we found that light did weird stuff, which led us to realize that atoms do weird stuff, and it doesn't fit these rules. So a whole new physics was developed, and that's quantum mechanics. But this world still exists. This world doesn't go away. Just because you go in a cave and do this world doesn't mean that this world goes away. So these two things have to be reconciled for a theory to be complete. That's called grand universal theory. But even you do that, there's this other thing that exists that neither one of you have dealt with, and that thing is bingo. And so if you really want to be a scientist / philosopher, you also have to reckon with that. It's another weird, spooky feature of reality that neither one of these accounts for. Okay. Now I'm going to try and put it all together. Here we go. When you talk about the law of gravity, when you talk about the laws of electromagnetism, when you talk about, Maxwell's laws, black box radiation, Kepler's laws, the word laws really just means magic. The word law is a misnomer. Because, well, first of all, law makes you think lawmaker. So it's not a law like that, because there's no lawmaker for these guys. That's number one. But beyond that, there's the idea that these laws are reasonable. But they're not. They just are. So really when you say the law of gravity, what you're really just saying is there's this weird thing where objects attract each other, Why? I don't know. Just is. Electricity also is magnetic. Why? I don't know, it just is. It's magic. You follow? We talk about, all these different laws. What we're really just saying is, this is how the world is. Because every philosopher has to start somewhere. And so what do? You just figure out what the most basic features of reality are, and then you call those things fundamental forces and fundamental particles and fundamental laws, and you just build the world out of those things. Why is matter equal to the speed of light squared? Why is energy equal to matter times the speed of light squared? Equals mc squared. Energy is equal to matter times the c as the speed of light squared. Why is energy equal to matter times the speed of light squared?
It just is.
It just is. I might have noticed it, but that doesn't mean I've explained why it is. It just means I've noticed that it is. You might as well just say, it's magic, presto. And so ultimately, you're trying to take things back to fundamental starting points. And those fundamental starting points become the premises of your argument. And those are the least doubtful things in the world. And you build off of them, and you can never explain them because they're just the fundamental features of reality. So ultimately, you're going to break the world down into one of two things. You're going to break the world down into a math formula, which represents the most basic stratum of the world. Or you're going to break the world down into a mathematician. It's got to be one of the two. The world is either a math formula or it's a mathematician. Why? Because the world follows rules and the world makes sense and the world is logical. And so if we look at the world came from something not chaotic, but something which made sense. So what is it? It's either a set of formulas or it's a formula maker. Those are your two best candidates. The existence of consciousness tilts the scale in favor of a mathematician, in favor of a formula maker, in favor of a conscious mathematician, a conscious lawmaker, a conscious maker of formulas, a logical person. Without consciousness, you could say it's a 50-50. You could go either way. With consciousness, it tilts the scale in favor of a personal deity, a conscious deity. Once you acknowledge that consciousness is a fundamental particle or force, a quantum of reality, an irreducible feature. Quanta are quantum is a single irreducible thing. And so the existence of consciousness, which is not being dealt with, which cannot be dealt with, I'm arguing, by physicalist theories because it's a non-physical reality. The existence of consciousness is a massive defeater. It's a massive thorn in the side. It's very little improvement's been made since the time of René Descartes. And in the same way that classical physicists had to accept that quantum reality existed, and that quantum reality can't think that they've explained the world because they haven't reconciled it with classical physics, neither one of these schools has reconciled the world with consciousness. And you have to, because consciousness exists. You can't simply ignore a big feature of reality. Like you can imagine if somebody's arm was cut off, and you're like, how you doing? They're like, I'm a picture of health. You're bleeding uncontrollably from your arm. They're like, but other than that, I'm a picture of health. Other than that one problem. Like somebody cuts your hand off, and you're just like gushing. And they're like, how's it going, bro? Like, I'm great. I'm good. Solid. No problems. Like, but your hand's missing. Like, yeah, but other than that. Other than this one massive gaping hole in my theory that makes it just absolutely incomplete, and like it just deals a death blow to my theory. Other than that one problem, I'm great. It's like I got a formula that explains everything. Your formula explains anything, but you just have to add x. If you add x, which is just any number, then my formula works. Then my formula works. If I just allow for any addition to be made to my formula. You follow? I got a formula, and my formula works, except for it doesn't work. So I'll just add an extra x element to the equation, and that extra x element to the equation is any additional feature that my equation doesn't have that will complete my equation. And so it's good. I've just got a big, massive X, some extra process that I don't know, that would then make my equation make sense. You following now? And so that the reality of consciousness tilts the scale in favor of a mathematician, a logical source of all reality. And here's the final point. I've become interested in consciousness. I think it's the last frontier. Even when I was experimenting with drugs, it eventually became some kind of a psychedelic exploration of consciousness. It was short-lived and with limited results, and those results were skewed by the intoxicating effects of psychedelics. But really, since I was a kid, it's like 13, I've been interested in consciousness. Even before that, I can remember, like my earliest memories, I can remember realizing my parents were going to die and that they couldn't save me, and that this idea that my mom and dad could save me and I'm safe with them if I'm scared, it wasn't true, because they're going to die and nothing's going to remain and we're all powerless, and there are these incredibly powerful forces that are controlling reality that go beyond us. I can remember that. I can remember waking up at night and feeling scared and going into my parents' bedroom. Of course, my parents wouldn't let me sleep in the bed with them because they're lame. So they made me sleep on the floor next to them. It's like the 70s, you know? It's like Dr. Spock. Was his name Dr.? No, Dr. Spock was Star Trek. Who's the guy who came up with the idea of making your kid cry themselves to sleep at night in their crib? Feed your kid formula. I'm from that generation. Feed your kids formula and cry themselves to sleep at night. So my parents, they'd be like, well, yeah, you can sleep on the floor next to us. And I remember laying there. I mean, I must have been 5 or 6. I remember laying there and thinking, if there were monsters, my parents couldn't protect me. And anyway, they're going to die. And wait a second, everyone's going to die. And what's this whole world about? And that gradually fomented into an interest in consciousness and plumbing the depths of consciousness and mining consciousness and figuring out what was going on with consciousness. It's no less scientific. It's perhaps, just as quantum mechanics is non-deterministic and it's probabilistic and it follows fuzzy rules, spooky rules according to Einstein, and it differs dramatically from classical mechanics with its just rigorous deterministic features. But it's no less real. Consciousness is fuzzier still than even the quantum world, spookier still. But it's no less real. It's in fact the least doubtable thing in reality. Your consciousness is what makes every single other field of human endeavor possible. And so it's a natural starting point. Like when you say theories have to start somewhere with something undoubtable, the least doubtable thing in existence is your own consciousness. And I'm interested in that. And it allows me to start to perceive a world and map a world beyond this physical world and solve the problem of death and solve the problem of everything being taken away and solve Freud's dilemma, where if you actually looked at the reality, everyone would become a nihilist. And we have to delude ourselves and live in denial of death. Because the actual reality of the charnel house in which we live is too much. And so we have to turn away from that because it's too much to face. People, their trauma is too much to face, so they get bent out of shape about some other thing. But they're really upset about this, but they can't get upset about this. So they get upset over here, and they never work this one out because they're unable to acknowledge it. The real source of their trauma. And so they're in anxiety about this or that or the other thing. Angry about this, that, or the other thing. Depressed about this, that, or the other thing. Instead of looking at the reality, which is just too gruesome. Too painful. And so, by looking at consciousness, by dealing with the reality of our consciousness, by addressing the real fundamental feature of existence and making that the centerpiece of our physics, the centerpiece of our science, the centerpiece of our philosophy. We're getting to the heart of who we are and what exists. And the fruit of that is you can conquer death. You can become peaceful about death. You can reconcile death. You can gracefully go old. You can gracefully die. And we shouldn't think that philosophy and spirituality and studying consciousness and putting time into these kind of things is any less respectable or deep or profound or scientific or logical or reasonable or defendable or astute or surgical than scientific pursuits. It's worth doing. It's worth doing. It's the right thing to do. So I was a kid. Now I'm old. When I met this person, they were 15 years younger than I am now. Now they're dead. Husband's dead, wife's dead. Their gurus passed away also. The world's just turning. And it's mind-blowing, actually, how short a time we're here for. How temporary all this stuff is. But there's this amazing feature that we can think about this stuff and figure stuff out. Meet the mathematician. Meet ourselves. Grapple with consciousness. Really have a grand universal theory. And the physics of atoms, sure. It's great. We should work those out. And figure out how to reconcile. That's great. But the most important physics is the physics of consciousness. And we should be proud that we're doing work in that field. We should be proud that we're doing experiments in that field. We should consider when we chant japa, when we do kirtan, when we think about the nature of reality, when we discuss it, we should think this is a worthwhile usage of my time. Because the fruit of it is you'll be able to face death down. You'll be able to face death down when it happens to your loved ones. You'll be able to face it down when it happens to you. It solves the problem of material existence. At least it has the potential to. None of these other theories even have the potential to do that. Quantum and classical mechanics, they don't have the potential. At least this other field has the potential to solve for that. This awareness that we're all going to die, that everything's going to be taken away, that's also temporary. This awareness is everyone's chronic trauma. We all have chronic trauma from our childhood, more or less, from bad parenting. But this chronic trauma, really PTSD, of the fact that we're all going to die and everything's going to decay. That's simmering beneath the surface of everyone's mind at all times. And we've got to spend energy all the time not going into that abyss. Like there's the abyss of I was molested, or I was raped, or I was beaten mercilessly, or I was neglected, or I was abandoned. There's that, abyss people don't want to look at. This is everyone's abyss. I want to get married, then my wife's going to die. My husband's going to die. I want to have kids, then I'm going to die on them. They're going to die on me. Everything I do is going to come to naught. What's your great grandfather's first name?
Which side?
You know both? You? We got 2. Who else knows their great grandfather's first name? 3, 4. Who else? 5. What's your great grandfather's first name?
Anthony.
Grandfather's first name?
Anthony.
Great grandfather's first name.
Great grandfather. Anthony.
And your grandfather's first name?
Oh no.
Huh?
Dan. Dan is my grandfather. My great grandfather. Anthony.
Okay. Great grandfather. Who knows it?
Well, it's easy for me because they're all the same name.
That doesn't count. Great grandfather. Who knows it? You follow? You get it? What is that? Father, 25 years. Grandfather, 50. Great-grandfather, 75. Great-great-grandfather, 100. Your own family, we don't even go back over 100 years. Who else is going to remember them? Who else is going to remember them? Investigating consciousness. That's a good place to put your time and your effort. All right, let's do a little kirtan. Thank you.